Hello everyone and welcome to Consuming JSON APIs in SwiftUI Applications, a beginner's guide. So I created this mini course for all the beginners out there who wants to learn how to consume JSON API, whether it is hosted locally or it is hosted somewhere else, into their SwiftUI applications. And this mini course is going to take you to all the required steps that you need. So we will be learning about the documentation for the API. Very, very important that you read the documentation for API because it will be very different for each JSON API or each API. And then creating the models, creating your client, meaning your network layer, and then finally displaying it on your SwiftUI screen. So all of this will be covered. And if you're a beginner, this is going to be great because JSON APIs and any kind of application, or most of the application that you will work with, they will be consuming some APIs. So this is going to give you on the right track of learning how to consume it. And once you start consuming it, well, there is unlimited number of options, unlimited number of APIs that you can use. So if you're ready, let's go ahead and get started. All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first thing that we want to do is to explore the API that we'll be consuming. And the API over here is food2fork.ca. One of the things that I can always recommend is that whenever you're consuming an API, make sure to read their documentation. And if you go to food2fork.ca, you will find out that this is their documentation. And the URL that we'll be using will be searching the recipes, the GET protocol. And we can see that this URL goes to food2fork.ca API recipe search, page number, okay. And then in the query, you pass in, I guess, the ingredients for which the recipes you wanted to return. The other things which are important about this particular API is that you have to pass in the authorization header. Now, this is not true for every single API, but that is why it's so important that you read their documentation. If you don't pass the authorization value in the headers, then the API will not return anything. All right? And don't worry, we're going to take a look at how we can pass in the authorization header. And this is great because now this is actually telling you that you are going to be getting a response which may look like this. Okay, that looks pretty good. You can see that on the top, the response is obviously JSON, but it's not really returning you an array on the top. That's the most important part. Do you see that? It's actually returning you an object. And that object has different properties like count, next, previous, and something called results. Now, results is a interesting property that we have inside this object because that does contain an array. You can see that right there. And this array contains, well, the recipes. So that's the first recipe. And you can see that each recipe has a lot of different things going on. We're just going to keep it simple. So I'm just going to show you how we can read the title of the recipe and the featured image. But that's pretty much it. Everything else we'll probably tackle it a little bit later in a different course because I want to keep it like really simple. If you are like trying to consume an API in Swift language and using the SwiftUI framework, and this is your first time, then I want to keep it simple. All right. Okay. So this is the API. We have a couple of different recipes in there. And the reason that I selected this particular API is, first of all, it's public. I mean, anyone can access it. Second of all, you need to pass in the headers. So you will learn that how to pass in the header. And final is just the structure of the API. It's not returning you an array at the top level. It's returning you an object. So how do we deal with that? Because what we really want is we want the results, not the top level part. All right. So we're going to be learning about all of that stuff. So go to food2fork.ca and you can check out their API. Now, once we are comfortable with the API, we can definitely read all the stuff that is API returning. The next step would be to create models which will map to the JSON that is returning. So this is all JSON. You can see it's all JSON being returned. So we need to create Swift models in our Swift language where we can map this stuff. Map means that the data over here, well, probably we want this, and this one will be transferred or mapped, meaning it will be assigned to a model that we will create in our application. So we need to create those models. All right. So in the next lecture, we'll be looking at that how we can start creating these models that can represent this particular response. All right. All right. Let's go to the next one and find out. Okay. So now we have to create our SwiftUI application. So I have launched Xcode and I'm going to say create new project. And in the iOS, we'll select app. That's perfectly fine. Name something for your project. So I'm just going to say my recipes, but you can name it anything you want. Make sure that the interface is selected SwiftUI because we'll be using SwiftUI. And next, where do you want to save it? I'm just going to say desktop. That's perfectly fine. Let's go ahead and create it. Okay, so this is our really basic, bare bones application. All the code that you see right now is written by SwiftUI itself, or Xcode. We haven't really done anything. So what do we want to do first? Well, we have this JSON response, and we want to create models that can represent the response, but we want to create the models in Swift language. And we want to create a model that can at least represent the title and the featured image. These are the two things that we actually need. So let's go ahead and create a model that can represent, that can contain a title and that can contain a featured image. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new group and I'll call it models. It's always a good idea to organize things nicely, right? And let's go ahead and add a new file. Swift file is fine. We'll say recipe. That's the name of our model. And whenever you're naming models, make sure that they are singular. So recipe. And now I can go ahead and create a model. Now, when people are creating models, they usually create it with struct because it's literally data. We're not really creating classes or anything. Classes are reference type and structs are value type. So they're going to hold a little bit, just data or information, and you can compare it also. All right. So we're going to just use a data point over here. It doesn't really have any identification itself right now. It just has a struct recipe. That's the name of our model that we're creating. Now the properties that we want is the title and the featured image. So let's go ahead and create a property called title and featured image. So I'm just going to copy this name over here and paste it. Now, one thing that is important is when you're creating these models and these properties that you have, like title and featured image, they have to match exactly with whatever is being returned from the JSON, title and featured image. But the problem is that in Swift, this is not really the convention. We're not really writing Python where we can use lower casing over here, or what is it called in Python? Not camel casing, snake casing. So it's not really snake casing. We need to use camel casing, like a good convention over here. And this is not how we write variable names in Swift language. So if I have to write this, I'm just going to go ahead and write it like this, featured image. But the problem with this approach is when it tries to map it, it looks for the same exact name in the JSON, which is featured underscore image. And then it says, oh, I need to map it to feature underscore image in recipe struct, but you're not going to find it because it's called featured image. There is no underscore over here. So now we are in a problem that, okay, what can we do in this situation? So in this situation, what we can do is we can create coding keys. And before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and also say that this is decodable. Decodable means that the JSON can be decoded into the recipe struct. So that's good, but we have to figure out a way so that the featured image can be mapped based on the other name, which is featured underscore image, all right, which is coming from the actual JSON. And for that, we can use private enum keys. So private enum coding keys, which will be string, and the other one will be coding key. And over here, we can actually specify that if the title is going to match something else, but title is title. I mean, the title in the recipe is matching one-to-one with the title from the JSON. So we don't really have to specify anything over there. But going over here, featured image, which is one of our properties that we define in line number 12, will be mapped to featured image, this one. So now we are telling that if you find a key featured image in JSON, that's going to be mapped to featured image, which is one of the properties. All right. So that's pretty good that we are able to do that, and we are able to create our recipe struct with different property names. And it doesn't really have to be featured image. I mean, you can call this any property anything you want. Just make sure that you map it correctly over here in coding keys. So this will be the recipe model, which is going to be mapping this part. Not all the properties of this, obviously. We're just mapping the title and the featured image. But what about the top part? I mean, that's the data that we actually get back. How can we make sure that this data, like an object which contains count and next and previous and results properties, these are mapped correctly? So what I usually do is in the same file, I create another struct and I call it recipe response. This is also decodable. This is going to be the parent one. This is going to be the response that we are getting from the URL. Like this is the response that we're getting. And recipe response, when we're creating, which is right here, is going to be mapping the outer thing, this thing. So we can create properties like count. I don't care about the count, or next or previous, which I don't really care right now about next or previous. And we can create a property called results. So results I do care about because that is an array of recipes. So let's go ahead and create a property, and I'll name it exactly like that, results. And what will be the results? Well, this part. And how are we representing this part? We're representing this part by our model called recipe. So it will be an array of recipes. So what's going to happen is that when we are decoding it, it's going to look at the recipe response and it's going to say, oh, it's results, which is mapped to recipes. So this will be whatever the array of recipes will be, it will be mapped to this one. All right. So when we get to the results in the outer part, which is this one, which is recipe response, when it goes to the results, this part, it knows that, oh, this will be mapped to recipe, or an array of recipe. So that's the important part. All right. And that's it. That's all the mapping that we need for now. All right. Now we have the mapping. The next step would be to actually implement some sort of a HTTP client or make a request and get the data. So let's go ahead and see how we can do that in the next lecture. All right, so now comes the fun part. We're going to implement our HTTP client layer that is going to fetch all the recipes, provided the URL, and it's going to give it to us. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. For that, I am just going to go ahead and create a new group. I'll call it clients. I mean, you can call it anything you want. And I'm going to put a new Swift file. I'll call it recipe client. All right. And the purpose and the job of the recipe client is to Well, fetch the recipes. All right, that's it. Give it to the view and the view can display it. So let's go ahead and get started. We are going to create a recipe client. There we go. And inside over here, I'm going to create a function, which will be called search recipe. And we can pass in a name, which will be string. And it's going to give us something. But what will it give us? Well, it's going to give us recipes, an array of recipes. All right. And this function, search recipe, is going to be an async function, and it can also throw an error. All right. So now let's go ahead and see what we can do inside over here. All right. The first thing we need is the URL. Well, the good thing is that we actually already have the URL, which is right here. So I'm just going to copy it over here. Now, if you're building a much bigger, obviously, application, these URLs, you can put them in a constant file, or these URLs can be coming from a JSON file or an info.plist. I mean, these URLs can be coming from anywhere, but we're just trying to keep things simple. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and use the URL over here. So let guard URL, and we're going to just use this URL that we have. There we go. And if there's a problem, like in creating the URL, then we can go ahead and throw in network error. So network error dot bad URL. Now, what is network error and what is bad URL? Well, that's the error that we're going to be throwing. So I'm just going to go ahead and quickly create a network error as an enum, which is going to represent an error, and that will only have one case, like bad URL, and that's it. All right, and this will be, I believe I'm missing an else, so I'm going to put the else. All right. So once we have the URL, we can go ahead and create a request. Now, there are many different ways of creating a request, but either way, we'll have to use the URL session.shared.data, and you can see the data task. So what this does is that if you pass in a URL or if you pass in a URL request object, it can go ahead and perform the request for you. And since we are using async and await, we are looking for the ones that actually support async and await. And you can see there are a couple of functions, data task, something that supports async and await, which is good because that's what we want to use. So this one is actually pretty good because this one is saying that if you simply pass in the URL, then it can give you all the data that you need, like recipes. Basically, it's going to give you all of this stuff. All right, and that will be hopefully correctly mapped, decoded to something else, which we'll have to do it later. But it's going to give us the data itself in bytes. But remember, this is not a normal kind of a service. Even though this has a URL that you can use, in order for this service to work, this API to work or consume, you have to pass in the authorization headers. That's very important. All right. So if you are using the URL as I'm trying to use, you may not be able to pass the authorization header. So we can't really use this one, but let's go to the next one, which is we can pass in a URL request. Okay, that's good. But how do we create a request? Let's create a request. Request equals to URL request. We're going to pass in the URL, which we already have. So I can pass in the URL. And now I can set the headers, set the request headers. Request dot add value, and this is the value of the header, and this is the header, actual header. So this is the key that you're passing, and this will be the value. So let's go back to the documentation, and you can see the key over here is authorization. So let's go ahead and copy the key, and we're going to pass it right here. And this is the value, the token and all that stuff. So let's go ahead and make sure you correctly copy it. Don't obviously type it out. I mean, who's going to be typing this out, right? It's crazy. Okay, so we got the request.add value. This is the token. That's what they're saying. And the authorization. Okay, that's good. And now we can pass it to the URL shared data. So request, pass in the request. This is the async function. So we have to await, and this can also blow up, so we have to use try. This is also going to return us a tuple, like a data and a response. All right, so we're getting closer. That's pretty good. So if this request goes through correctly, we will get the data that we want right there. Isn't that cool? All right. Now, other steps that you can do over here is check the response. So I'll go over here and check the response. HTTP response. I will try to cast this as a HTTP URL response. And the reason I'm doing that is that I want to check the status code. So let's check the status code, like HTTP response.status code. If it is equals to 200, then it's good. Else, well, again, we have to throw the error. Maybe something bad happening. We get the invalid response. And since I'm using a network error over here, I have to go and update it over here, saying invalid response. All right. Okay, so that's pretty good. If we pass that point, then hopefully we'll get the actual data, and we can decode it using the JSON decoder. Remember, the data that you're getting right here is data, meaning bytes, right? So we need to decode it and map it to our recipes. So JSON decoder.decode, and over here we're going to pass in the type. So when we are getting all of this stuff, all of this, including from the top part, all of this stuff we're getting, this will map to who? Is this going to map correctly to the recipe struct, or do you think it's going to map to the recipe response? Who is responsible for the outer part of it, which represents the whole response? Recipe response. Okay, so let's go back. We'll say recipe response dot self. So this is the type on which it will be decoded to, and this is the data that will be decoded. Now again, we can use a let over here. We'll get some sort of a data that we're trying to get. I guess let me actually check what we're getting, like some sort of a recipe response. So we can simply say recipe response. There we go. And if there's a problem in decoding, then we can again throw an error. We can say network error dot, decoding error or something. And you can pass in like the error over here, but just keeping it simple. Decoding error. All right. After, if this goes through, then hopefully we'll have our stuff. So we can say recipe response dot results, which is an array of the recipes. Great. And that's it. That will be our recipe client that we're building. Meaning the recipe client, meaning that this is going to be performing the request on this URL. All right. Do you see something wrong over here? Actually, if you see over here, see that? Query is equals to beef, carrot, potato, and onion, although that sounds really good, but it will always be that. So what we want to do is we want to push the name of the recipe or name of the ingredients that the person is typing into over there. All right, whether it is a name or whatever you want to call it. So I'm just going to go ahead and replace this part with name. Now it might not be the name. I mean, these are kind of like ingredients, I guess, but I'm just going to call it name. All right. Okay, so this is our recipe client. I think it looks good right now. And the next thing we want to do is to actually use the recipe client to display information, to request information from our SwiftUI part of it, like the view, and then display it. So we're going to be looking at that later on. All right, everyone. Now let's go ahead and move on to the side of SwiftUI so that we can call our recipe client, get the data, and display it on the screen. So I'm going to move to the content view. And you can see the content view is really nothing going on. It's just saying hello world, and that's pretty much it. So what we want to do is to make a call, get the data, and obviously display it. So I'm going to go ahead and start with adding a text field because we want to allow the user to enter the name of the recipe, or I guess the name of the ingredients that they want. So I'm just going to say enter name. And whenever the person is typing something, that has to go somewhere. So I'm going to go ahead and create a state variable over here, and I'll simply call it recipe name like this. And it's going to go ahead and bind to that. So whenever we type something in the text field, the recipe name will be updated, or that will have the data. Let's go ahead and also have the text style over here. So text field style, we can actually use rounded border. It looks nicer. Okay. And on submit is where we actually make the call. So whenever you press a return key inside the text field, this is where we perform the call. In order to perform the call, we should have access to the recipe client. So I'm going to go ahead and create a recipe client over here. Recipe client, recipe client. Now this is a simple application. So we're not really doing any dependency injection and mocking and those kind of things. So I'm just creating this recipe client right over here. And there's not much logic in the app itself also. I mean, you're going to use a recipe client to perform a request from the API. It's going to give you the result, and your job is to display the result on the screen, and that's it. If there is any logic, which there is not, that's mostly on the server side. All right. So I can use the recipe client now. So I can say recipe client dot, and I can perform search recipe. Now, one of the things that you notice about the search recipe is a little bit faded out. Do you know why it's faded out? Can you guess? Well, it's actually telling you over here. It's saying that the searched recipe is used in a context that does not support concurrency. So we're not in an async context over here. But one way of doing things, and I know there are other ways that you can use task modifier and all that, but I just want to keep it simple. So inside the task closure over here, now we are in the async and await or async context. And now we can call our async function. So recipe client, and now you can see that it appears. Recipe name or search recipe, we're passing in the name. So I guess I can pass in the recipe name over here. And since the search recipe is a async function, we have to await for it. And since it can throw, we have to use try. Now, if I'm using try, I can use try this or try this. But if I'm using just try, then I have to also catch the error. So let's go ahead and catch it. And we're just going to display it on the console. That's it. Now the search recipe is going to return you something, but we're not really capturing that. So let me go ahead and create a state variable. We'll call it recipes, and it will be an array of recipes. We'll start with an empty array. So whenever the search recipe is going to return you something, we'll simply assign it to the recipes. And whenever you assign it to the recipes, it will perform evaluation. It's going to ask all the controls. It's going to check out that which needs to be re-rendered. Now, currently we're not really using recipes anywhere, but obviously we want to display the recipes also. So let's go ahead and use it. So I'm going to use list and for recipes, and we can go ahead and display it. We'll say recipe, and I'll start with simply displaying the name of the recipe. It's always a good idea to start small, just the title of the recipe. Well, if we do that, we get some weird error over here saying that the initializer row count requires the recipe to conform to identifiable. And the reason is that we are using some sort of a loop, and it needs to verify that each of these things that it's going to be creating, it will have a unique ID. So what we can do is go back to the recipe and just make sure that it is conforming to identifiable. Now, just by putting identifiable with the recipe doesn't work, because we also want to make sure that this is conforming. And one way to conform is to add a property called ID. That's the required part. Okay. Now, one of the good things about our JSON API is that it already returns something that is a unique. Like it's called PK for primary key, but I don't want to use PK, so I'm going to go ahead and create a ID over here, which is integer. Just by using the ID, it's going to conform to the identifiable. All right. And we also need to put over here that the ID is actually going to map to a key in the JSON called PK. Because if you look over here in your JSON, there is no such thing as ID. There's PK. So we did the same exact thing that we did with the featured image. In the JSON, we have featured underscore image, but we're saying that, well, featured underscore image will be mapped to featured image. So in the same way, we're saying PK, which is in the JSON, is going to be mapped to the ID. And we have to call this an ID. I mean, if I call it like something else, like, ABC, it's going to complain because now it is not conforming to identifiable. In order to conform to the identifiable protocol, it has to be called ID, and that's why I'm calling it ID. Okay, let's go back. Okay, so that error goes away, which is great. And now we can kind of like test it out, right? I mean, let's go ahead and test it out. So I'm going to go ahead and put some name over here. I'm going to just say beef. And I press enter, and here we go. We got all the stuff over here. All these different awesome dishes which involve beef. Let's remove the padding and see if it looks much better without the padding. Ooh, if we remove the padding, then the text also doesn't have padding. So probably I want to add a little bit padding on the text box or the text field. Okay, that's fine. All right, let's search for cake. Okay, looks pretty good. We got the cake and everything. We are on the right track. I mean, we got all the stuff. Very good. Now, one of the things that we want to do or display is the image. I mean, that will really make our application really good, right? We are getting the image because featured image over here from the JSON is pointing to some image, and we are mapping this in our recipe, which is right here. So we already have something called featured image. It's basically a URL. So let's go back. And I'll put a H stack over here. And one of the controls that you can use to get the image, to download the image, is called the async image view or async image. And we can actually use that. So we'll have to pass in the URL, which is recipe.featuredImage. Well, featured image is not really a URL, it's string. Well, no problem. We can always go back to our recipe and change that to a URL. There we go. Which is great because from JSON, it's actually coming as a URL. So it's going to be mapped exactly one-to-one to featured image. I mean, because it's a URL, it's going to map correctly. All right. The next thing over here is the image. We'll get the image. And we will simply say image.resizable. And for the placeholder, which basically means, I think, when it's loading. So I'm just going to show a progress view. And in the progress view, I'm just going to say loading. But you can use any control over here, any view over here. You don't have to use progress view if you don't want to. Okay, let's go ahead and search for cake. Okay, we got some images also. I mean, all these images looks kind of weird. They're a little bit big and stretched out. Not a big deal. We can actually make them a little bit smaller. We can provide some sort of a frame over here. Let's say 100 and height to be 100 if you want. Let's see how that looks. And let's search for cake again. Okay, definitely much better, definitely. And if you want to go one more step, and I don't want to talk too much about this, but let me just go ahead and add clip shape so that we can even clip the shape of the image, making it rounded. So now let's search for cake. Oh yeah, now it looks much better. Okay, yeah, there we go. Pretty cool, right? All right. So there you have it. I mean, it didn't really took us that much time. And this is one of those things that is so important that you know how to consume an API. Because every single job that you will go to, most probably they are either consuming their own API, which is their own backend, or they are using a third-party service or consuming a third-party URLs or third-party APIs. And one thing to always remember is that not every single API will look like this. I mean, over here, you're passing something in the headers. Maybe in some other APIs that you're dealing with, you don't have to pass anything. This one only supports GET, but maybe there are API that supports GET and POST and PUT and delete and all that stuff, right? So it's always a good idea to read the documentation for the API because that is how you will learn about the API. All right. So hopefully you have enjoyed this course. It's a small course and it will get you started with consuming an API, which is such a important task. And make sure that you download all the code. So the final code is right here with this lecture. So make sure you download it. And thank you so much for watching. And I really hope that you have enjoyed the course. Thank you. So first of all, congratulations for completing the course. I'm super proud of you. Awesome work. So what will be your next steps after you have completed the course? Now, this was a mini course, right? And you learn how to perform a GET request. But there is a GET request, there is a POST request, there's update, patch, put, delete request, and a lot more that goes on when you're creating applications. So if you go to azamsharp.school and if you scroll down, you'll see a list of a lot of different courses. But I think your next step, depending on your need, would either be MV design pattern, because it goes into more detail of how you can construct a much larger applications and how you can perform, GET request and POST request and all that stuff. So if I go over here and check this course out, you can definitely check it out. You can see over here. It covers validation. It covers ordering coffee application with, GET request and POST request, how to create the web server and all that kind of stuff. So it goes into more detail. And if you're interested in, well, I want to create an API, but I want to live in that iOS ecosystem. I don't want to learn Django or Node or JavaScript or Java or C#. I want to stay in the iOS ecosystem. Then the full stack iOS development, that is a course for you. This is a great course. This is the best course that is available. And it's going to teach you how you can create your own API, own server using Swift language and Vapor framework. Now, this is a very detailed course. It goes on for like 12 hours. I'm going to start with the basic stuff, how to install the tools, then routing, then controllers, middleware, deployment, Postgres database, MongoDB database. Wow, it goes into a lot of stuff, even authentication. All right. So 2 different courses, depending on which path you want to take. You can always visit azamsharp.school and check out some other courses also. And here's another thing I'm going to do. Check out for this lecture, if you check out the resources, there should be a text file, and I'll include some discounted coupons for MV pattern course as well as full stack iOS development. But hey, keep in mind, those coupons are limited. So they're not like forever. So make sure that if you are trying to use those coupons, use them instantly because they're not going to be available in the future. So that's pretty much it. Hope you have enjoyed the course, and I'll check it out and I'll see you in other courses. Thank you.